The morning sun barely peeked through the clouds as Officer James Miller adjusted his badge in the rearview mirror of his patrol car. His stern face reflected back at him, showing the deep frown lines that had formed over his 8 years on the force. At just 32, he had already earned quite a reputation in the Oak Hills district, and not a particularly good one. Another day, another chance to clean up these streets. He muttered to himself, sipping his black coffee while scanning the neighborhood through his windshield. The predominantly black and Hispanic area had been his beat for the past 3 years, and he'd developed what he called a zero-tolerance approach. The radio crackled with the day's first call. Unit 247. We got a noise complaint at Madison and 5th. Miller rolled his eyes, knowing exactly where that was, the community center where local teens often gathered in the mornings. As he pulled up to the scene, he saw a group of young black teenagers playing basketball, their laughter and shouts echoing off the buildings. Without hesitation, Miller stepped out of his car, hand resting on his belt. "Break it up. Now," he barked, watching as the smiles dropped from their faces. One of the boys, probably around 15, stepped forward holding the basketball. "Officer, we're just playing before school. Ms. Washington gave us permission to." "I don't care who gave you permission," Miller cut him off. "This is a residential area. Get moving before I write you all up for disturbing the peace." The boys quickly gathered their things and scattered, throwing nervous glances over their shoulders. Miller noticed one of his fellow officers, Rodriguez, watching from her patrol car with disapproval. Back at the station later that morning, Sergeant Thompson called Miller into his office. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Thompson held up a folder thick with complaint forms. "This is the 3rd time this month, Miller. We've got citizens reporting excessive force, racial profiling, and aggressive behavior." Miller stood straight, jaw clenched. "Sir, I'm just doing my job. This district needs a firm hand. Crime rates are..." "Save it," Thompson interrupted. "The numbers don't support your methods. In fact, community relations have gotten worse since you started this tough guy routine. With all due respect, sir, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs." Thompson leaned back in his chair, looking tired. "That's the problem, Miller. These aren't eggs. They're people. Our people. The ones we're supposed to protect and serve." As Miller left the station that evening, he noticed a flyer on the bulletin board about upcoming sensitivity training. He scoffed, crumpling up the reminder notice Thompson had given him and tossing it in the trash. Driving home through his beat one last time, he passed the now empty community center. An elderly black woman was locking up, and for a split second, their eyes met through his car window. There was something in her gaze, not fear like he was used to seeing, but something else. Something that made him uncomfortable. Miller shook off the feeling and pressed the gas pedal harder. He didn't need to change. The community needed to adapt to him. That's what he told himself as he pulled into his driveway in the suburbs, miles away from his patrol area. Little did Officer James Miller know that elderly woman's gaze would soon become a regular part of his life, and the next day would bring a wake-up call that would shake his world to its very core. But for now, he climbed the steps to his empty house, still convinced he was right, still certain his way was the only way to police these streets. The seeds of change were about to be planted, whether he was ready or not. The next afternoon turned out to be unusually hot for spring. Officer Miller's patience was already wearing thin as sweat trickled down his neck. He'd spent the morning handing out tickets for the smallest violations, earning dirty looks from everyone he encountered. Around 2 p.m., he spotted a silver Toyota Camry rolling through a stop sign on Maple Street. The car was moving slowly, clearly driven by an elderly person, but Miller flipped on his lights anyway. He watched as the vehicle carefully pulled over, taking longer than he thought necessary. "License and registration," he barked before even reaching the driver's window completely. Inside sat an elderly black woman in her late 60s, dressed in a neat purple church suit. She was fumbling with her purse, moving too slowly for Miller's liking. "Officer, I apologize. I'm just trying to," she began in a dignified voice. "Ma'am, I don't have all day," Miller snapped, his temper rising with the temperature. He noticed she was the same woman he'd seen at the community center the night before. The woman, Mrs. Eleanor Washington, looked up at him with those same piercing eyes he remembered. "Young man, there's no need for that tone. I'm getting my documents right now." Something about her calm demeanor made Miller even angrier. He was used to people being afraid of him, not this quiet confidence she showed. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice hard. "I beg your pardon?" Mrs. Washington asked, genuinely surprised. "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." Miller's voice rose sharply. Mrs. Washington slowly opened her door, her movements careful and deliberate. "Officer, I believe you're overreacting. I'm simply—" Before she could finish, Miller grabbed her arm roughly to pull her from the car. In the process, he slapped away her hand as she reached for her cane for support. The sound of the slap echoed through the quiet street. Several onlookers gasped, and someone started recording with their phone. Mrs. Washington stood there, one hand on her car for balance, the other pressed against her stinging arm, but her eyes never lost their dignity. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer," Miller started to say, reaching for his handcuffs. "Miller," a booming voice cut through the scene. It was Captain Richards, who had been driving by and witnessed the whole thing. He jumped out of his unmarked car, face red with fury. "Stand down. Stand down right now," Richards ordered, rushing over. The next few minutes were a blur. Other officers arrived. Statements were taken. Phone videos were collected. Mrs. Washington refused medical attention, but accepted a ride home from a female officer who knew her from church. Before she left, Mrs. Washington looked directly at Miller, who was now standing off to the side, beginning to realize the magnitude of what he'd done. "I'll be seeing you very soon, Officer Miller," she said quietly, her voice carrying no anger, just certainty. Back at the station, Miller sat in front of Captain Richards' desk, his badge and gun already surrendered. The captain was on the phone, his face getting redder by the minute. "Yes, sir. Yes, I understand. No, he won't be on patrol during the investigation." "Yes, sir. First thing Monday morning." Miller stared at the floor, his mind racing. He'd crossed a line. He knew that now. But he had no idea that this moment, this terrible lapse in judgment, was about to connect with his future in ways he never could have imagined. As he left the station on mandatory leave, the weight of his actions finally started to sink in. Monday morning loomed ahead, promising consequences he couldn't yet foresee. Little did he know, his worst fear wasn't the disciplinary action coming his way. It was who would be delivering it. Monday morning arrived with a heavy feeling in the air. Officer Miller trudged into the police department's training room, his uniform feeling stiff and uncomfortable. After the incident on Friday, he'd spent the weekend dreading this mandatory sensitivity training session. The room was packed with other officers, all mumbling and checking their phones. Miller slumped into a chair at the back, hoping to stay invisible. He'd heard rumors about a new police community relations director starting today, some hotshot from downtown who was supposed to revolutionize the department. "Good morning, officers," a familiar voice rang out from the doorway. Miller's head snapped up so fast his neck hurt. His face went pale, and his mouth dropped open. There, standing at the front of the room in a crisp navy blue suit, was Mrs. Eleanor Washington, the same woman he'd mistreated just 3 days ago. She moved with grace despite the slight bruise still visible on her arm, a silent reminder of their last encounter. "I'm Mrs. Eleanor Washington, your new police community relations director," she announced, her voice carrying authority that made even the most seasoned officers sit up straighter. "Some of you may know me from my 30 years as a civil rights attorney, or perhaps from my work with the Community Justice Initiative." Miller tried to shrink into his chair, but Mrs. Washington's eyes found him immediately. She didn't glare or show anger. Somehow, her calm acknowledgement was even worse. "Officer Miller," she called out, making him freeze. "Please move to the front row. I believe we'll both benefit from having you closer to the discussion." Red-faced, Miller shuffled to the front as his fellow officers watched. He could hear whispers behind him. The story of Friday's incident had spread like wildfire through the department. Mrs. Washington began her presentation, clicking through slides that showed statistics about police-community relations. But she wasn't just throwing numbers at them. She was telling stories. Stories about families in their district, about kids who grew up fearing the police instead of trusting them, about elderly residents who remembered a time when police officers knew everyone on their beat by name. "Now," she said, pausing on a slide that showed the community center Miller had hassled the teenagers at, "let's talk about recent incidents that have damaged our relationship with the community." Miller's stomach churned as she played the video from Friday. Seeing himself from this perspective, watching his aggressive behavior, seeing how he manhandled this dignified woman who now stood before him as his superior, made him want to disappear through the floor. But Mrs. Washington didn't humiliate him. Instead, she used the incident as a teaching moment. "This," she said, pointing to the screen, "is what fear-based policing looks like. And this," she switched to a new slide showing officers playing basketball with kids at the community center, "is what community-based policing looks like." As the session continued, Miller noticed something strange. Mrs. Washington kept calling on him, not to embarrass him, but to ask his opinion, to challenge his thinking. When he tried to defend his old methods, she didn't shut him down. She asked him why he thought that way. By the end of the session, Miller's head was spinning. As everyone filed out, Mrs. Washington called out, "Officer Miller, please stay behind." His colleagues shot him sympathetic looks as they left. Once they were alone, Mrs. Washington sat down across from him, folded her hands on the table, and said something that would change everything. "James, you're going to be working directly with me for the next 3 months. Sometimes, the best way to learn is from our mistakes. Are you ready to learn?" Miller stared at her, realizing this was either going to be the most challenging or the most transformative period of his career. Possibly both. The community center buzzed with voices as Officer Miller stood uncomfortably against the wall, watching Mrs. Washington work the room. It had been 2 weeks since she'd become his supervisor, and every day brought new challenges that made him question everything he thought he knew about policing. "Officer Miller," Mrs. Washington called out, "come meet Mr. Johnson. He's been running the youth basketball program here for 30 years. Miller walked over to meet an elderly man with kind eyes and gray hair. It was the same program he'd shut down that morning weeks ago. Mr. Johnson looked at him with recognition, but offered his hand anyway. "So, you're the officer Mrs. Washington's been telling me about," Mr. Johnson said, shaking Miller's hand firmly. "You know, those kids you scattered that morning. 3 of them are honor students. One's headed to college on a basketball scholarship." Miller felt the familiar burn of shame in his chest. Before he could respond, a teenage boy walked in. The same one who'd tried to explain about having permission to play basketball. "Marcus, come here," Mrs. Washington called to the boy. "Officer Miller has something he'd like to say to you." Miller shot a panicked look at Mrs. Washington, who simply nodded encouragingly. This was her way, creating moments that forced him to face the impact of his actions. I'm sorry about that morning," Miller managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. "I was wrong to treat you and your friends that way." Marcus studied him for a moment before nodding. "You know, my little brother used to want to be a cop. After that morning, he said he didn't anymore." The words hit Miller like a punch to the gut. Mrs. Washington stepped in, placing a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Well, perhaps Officer Miller can help change his mind. He'll be helping coach the youth basketball program every Thursday morning." "I will," Miller blurted out, then caught Mrs. Washington's stern look. "Yes, I will." As the evening progressed, Miller found himself in conversations he'd never imagined having. He learned that the suspicious man he'd repeatedly stopped walking home late at night was actually a hospital janitor working double shifts to pay for his daughter's college. The rowdy teenagers he dispersed from the corner store were part of a peer tutoring program, meeting there because it was halfway between their homes. During a break, Miller found himself alone with Mrs. Washington, watching the community members interact. "You know," she said quietly, "every person in this room has a story. When you wear that badge, you become part of their story. The question is, what role do you want to play?" Miller watched as Marcus taught some younger kids how to dribble. Mr. Johnson was telling jokes to a group of elderly residents. The hospital janitor was sharing photos of his daughter's Dean's List certificate. "I never knew," Miller admitted. "I never tried to know." "That's right," Mrs. Washington said. "You saw threats instead of neighbors. But it's not too late to change that story." As they were closing up the center that night, Miller heard laughter from the basketball court. Marcus and his friends were back, shooting hoops under the streetlights. His first instinct was to reach for his radio, but Mrs. Washington's hand on his arm stopped him. "Watch," she said. The teenagers were teaching a younger boy how to shoot. Their patience, their encouragement, their joy. It was everything Miller had missed before when all he saw was a group to disperse. "Sometimes," Mrs. Washington said, "the best policing is knowing when to let community take care of community." Miller nodded, finally beginning to understand. As they walked to their cars, he could still hear the rhythmic bounce of the basketball and the sounds of young laughter. Sounds that, for the first time, made him smile instead of scowl. The late afternoon sun streamed through Mrs. Washington's office window as she and Officer Miller sat down for their weekly meeting. 2 months had passed since that first training session, and the changes in Miller were starting to show. Though today, something was clearly bothering him. "You seem troubled, James," Mrs. Washington said, using his first name, as she always did during their private conversations. She poured him a cup of tea, something that had become their ritual. Miller stared into the steaming cup. "Yesterday, I pulled over a young black man for a broken taillight. He was terrified, Mrs. Washington. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely find his license." He paused, his voice growing quiet. "And I realized, I used to feel proud when people feared me like that." Mrs. Washington leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Tell me about your father, James." The question caught him off guard. "What does my father have to do with this?" "Humor me," she said gently. Miller shifted uncomfortably. "He was a cop too. Old school. Taught me that respect comes from fear. That the only way to control a neighborhood is to make sure everyone knows who's in charge." He looked up at Mrs. Washington. "He was wrong, wasn't he?" She nodded slowly. "Fear isn't respect, James. It's poison. It poisons the one feeling it, and the one causing it." She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph. "This was taken in 1964, during my first civil rights march." Miller leaned forward to look. In the photo, a much younger Mrs. Washington stood facing a line of angry police officers. Despite the chaos around her, her expression showed the same dignity he'd seen the day he'd pulled her over. "One of those officers," she continued, "was my father's age. He looked at me with such hatred that day. But 20 years later, he came to my law office. He wanted to apologize. Said he'd been carrying the shame of those days for decades." Miller felt his throat tighten. "How did you forgive him?" "The same way I forgave you, James, by seeing the person behind the badge who was ready to change." She took back the photograph. "But here's the real question. How do you forgive yourself?" The question hit home. Miller had been struggling with guilt over his past actions, especially since he'd started seeing the community through new eyes. "I don't know if I can," he admitted. "The hardest part of growth isn't learning new things," Mrs. Washington said, standing to look out her window at the community below. "It's unlearning the old things, unlearning fear, unlearning prejudice, unlearning the idea that power means control." She turned back to him. "You know what I see when I look at you now. I see a man wrestling with his conscience. That's good. That's necessary. But don't let guilt paralyze you. Let it motivate you. Miller stood and joined her at the window. They watched as people went about their evening. Kids playing, families walking, teenagers hanging out on stoops. All the things he used to see as suspicious now looked different to him. "Mrs. Washington," he said slowly, "I want to start a program. Something to help other officers see what you've shown me. Maybe if we can change one officer at a time." She smiled, and for the first time, Miller saw pride in her eyes. "Now you're thinking like a leader, James, but remember, this journey isn't over. It's a daily choice to be better than you were yesterday." As Miller left her office that evening, he passed by the community center. Inside, he could see Marcus coaching his little brother in basketball. The same brother who'd stopped wanting to be a police officer. Miller made a mental note to visit them tomorrow, not as an authority figure, but as a neighbor who needed to rebuild trust, one conversation at a time. The police department's main conference room was packed. Officers from 3 different precincts sat shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on Officer Miller as he stood at the podium. Behind him, Mrs. Washington watched with quiet pride as he prepared to present his new community outreach program. 6 months ago, Miller began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I was a different officer. Actually, I was a different person." He clicked to the first slide, a photo of himself writing tickets outside the community center. "This was me, thinking I was doing my job by spreading fear." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, perhaps seeing themselves in Miller's words. Then something happened, he continued, clicking to the next slide. The infamous video of his encounter with Mrs. Washington. Several officers looked down, remembering that day. "I made a mistake that could have ended my career. Instead, it changed my life." Miller walked away from the podium, choosing to stand closer to his audience. "Last week, I arrested a young man for drug possession. But instead of just throwing him in jail, I learned his story. He's raising his little sister alone because their mother is sick. He couldn't find a job because of a previous record. He felt trapped." He paused, letting his words sink in. "In the old days, I would have just seen another criminal. But thanks to Mrs. Washington's mentorship, I saw a person who needed help. Today, that young man is enrolled in our department's new job training program. His sister is getting support from our community services, and he's becoming part of the solution instead of being labeled as the problem." The room was silent now, every officer fully engaged. Miller clicked to another slide showing the basketball court at the community center, now filled with officers playing alongside local teens. "This is what real policing looks like," he said passionately. "It's not about power. It's about partnership. That's why I'm proposing the Bridge the Gap program. Every officer will spend 1 day a week working directly with community members, not patrolling, participating." He outlined his plan. Officers teaching sports, helping at food banks, mentoring teens, and attending community events. But the most important part was the listening sessions, where officers would hear directly from residents about their experiences with law enforcement. Captain Richards, who'd been skeptical at first, stood up. "And you're saying this program has already reduced complaints in your precinct?" Miller nodded. "By 60% in just 3 months. Arrest rates are down, but more importantly, community trust is up. People are starting to see us as allies, not enemies." From the back of the room, a rookie officer raised his hand. "But won't this make us look soft? How can we maintain authority?" Miller smiled, remembering when he used to think the same way. "The strongest authority comes from respect, not fear. Let me tell you about Marcus." He shared the story of the basketball program, how the teenager who once feared police was now helping officers connect with other young people, how his little brother wanted to be a cop again. As Miller concluded his presentation, Mrs. Washington stepped forward. "Officer Miller has shown us that change is possible, but it requires courage. The courage to admit when we're wrong, the courage to learn, and the courage to be vulnerable with the community we serve." The room erupted in applause. As officers lined up to learn more about volunteering for the program, Miller felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Mrs. Washington. "You did good, James," she said softly. "But remember." "I know," he smiled. "The work is never done." Looking at the enthusiastic response from his fellow officers, Miller felt hope. Real change was possible. He'd learned it the hard way, but now he could help others learn it the right way. 1 year had passed since that fateful traffic stop. Officer James Miller stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his dress uniform. Today was special, the department's annual Community Appreciation Day. But this year was different. This year, he was receiving an award for his Bridge the Gap program, which had spread to 12 other precincts across the state. "Ready for your big speech?" Mrs. Washington appeared in the doorway of his office, her eyes twinkling with pride. "Ready as I'll ever be," Miller replied, turning to face the woman who had changed his life. "You know, I almost called in sick today." Mrs. Washington raised an eyebrow. "And why is that?" "Because saying thank you in front of hundreds of people seems harder than admitting I was wrong." He chuckled nervously. Outside in the park, the celebration was in full swing. Officers were grilling burgers alongside community members. Kids were getting their photos taken in police cars, not as suspects, but as excited youngsters dreaming of serving their community. Marcus was there too, now wearing a police cadet uniform, helping younger children learn basketball drills. As Miller took the stage, he saw familiar faces in the crowd. The hospital janitor he used to harass was there with his daughter, now a college graduate. Mr. Johnson from the community center sat in the front row. Even Miller's old partner, Rodriguez, who had once disapproved of his behavior, was beaming with pride. "A year ago," Miller began, his voice carrying across the park, "I thought I knew what it meant to be a good police officer. I was wrong. I confused fear with respect, power with authority, and control with safety." He paused, looking at Mrs. Washington sitting on the stage behind him. "Then I met someone who showed me that true strength isn't in how many tickets you write or arrests you make. It's in how many lives you touch, how many bridges you build, and how many hearts you change, including your own." Miller gestured to the crowd. "Look around you. This is what real community policing looks like. It's Officers Johnson and Martinez coaching Little League. It's Sergeant Thompson teaching computer skills at the senior center. It's Officer Rodriguez running a women's self-defense class." He pulled out an old photo, the one Mrs. Washington had shown him of her civil rights march. This photo was taken decades ago, showing a divide between police and community that seemed impossible to bridge. Today, we're not just bridging that divide, we're erasing it. Tears glistened in his eyes as he continued. "To the community members who gave me a second chance, thank you. To my fellow officers who were brave enough to change with me, thank you. And to Mrs. Eleanor Washington," he turned to face her, "who saw potential for good in this former evil cop, thank you for not giving up on me." The crowd erupted in applause as Miller helped Mrs. Washington to her feet, hugging her gently. As they pulled apart, she whispered, "I'm proud of you, James." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Miller walked through the park picking up stray paper plates and cups. A small boy approached him, wearing a plastic police badge. "Officer Miller," the boy said shyly, "my brother Marcus says you're the best cop ever now. Can you teach me how to be like you?" Miller knelt down to the boy's level, remembering how he used to tower over people to intimidate them. "I'll teach you something even better," he said. "I'll teach you how to be yourself while serving others. That's what real policing is about." As the sun set over the park, Miller watched Mrs. Washington chatting with a group of new recruits. He smiled, knowing that his story would be part of their training, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that change is always possible, that it's never too late to become the person you should have been all along. The evil cop was gone, replaced by something far more powerful, a guardian of his community, a builder of bridges, and a testament to the power of transformation. The end.